The air in the living room was thick, not from heat, but from unspoken tension. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, scattering fractured light across the worn oak table that had been in the family for generations. On it, in front of me, lay a single folded document. My fingers rested on it lightly, as if even touching it too firmly might set off a storm. Ethan sat to my right, his posture leaning back in casual confidence, one leg crossed over the other. He looked every bit like the successful man he believed himself to be. Tailored shirt, polished watch, that familiar smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Melissa sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails clicking against the glass. Across from me, Clara, my 87-year-old mother, sat in her favorite cardigan, her sharp eyes scanning the room with quiet understanding. No one spoke. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones. Then I said, "Since you've both been asking about the house, I think it's time I read you something." Melissa glanced up briefly, eyebrows raised. "Oh? Finally ready to be reasonable?" Her tone was light, but the edge underneath was unmistakable. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Mom, come on. You don't have to make this dramatic. We're just trying to make sure everyone's set up for the future." Clara shifted in her chair. "The future is built on respect, Ethan," she said softly, but he didn't even look at her. I ignored the sting in his words and slowly unfolded the document. The paper crackled in my hands, a sound that seemed to make Melissa's tapping stop and Ethan's smirk falter just for a second. Before I started, I looked at each of them. I saw the impatience in Ethan's eyes, the anticipation in Melissa's, and the steady calm in my mother's. I had been silent long enough. Today, the silence would end. "This," I said, holding up the document slightly, "is your father's will." Melissa's lips parted. "David's will? But he's been gone for 12 years, I said, not looking at her. "And in those 12 years, I've tried to honor him, to keep the family together. But lately," I let my voice trail off. "It seems the house has become more important to you than the family that lived in it." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Mom, that's not fair. We're just being practical. You're living here alone. You could sell this place, buy yourself something smaller, and still have money left over. Everyone wins." "Everyone?" I tilted my head. "Or just you?" The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her paper-thin skin warm against mine. "Margaret," she whispered, "just read it." I unfolded the rest of the document and began. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled just slightly. "I, David Kane, being of sound mind and body," the familiar legal phrases rolled out, sterile and formal. But when I reached the line I'd been waiting for, my voice grew stronger. "I leave our family home, located at 214 Willow Lane, solely to my wife, Margaret Kane, with the expressed wish that it is never to be sold unless she, and she alone, chooses." Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. I looked up from the page, meeting his gaze. "Do you understand what that means, Ethan? This house is not yours. It's not an investment. It's not a bargaining chip. It's mine. And your father wanted it to stay that way." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Mom, you're twisting this into something it's not. We're trying to help you." "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "You're trying to help yourselves." Melissa sat up straighter, her tone growing sharper. "That's unfair. We've been patient for years, waiting for you to see reason." "Reason?" I echoed. "Reason is taking care of what your father and I built together. Reason is respecting the roof that sheltered you, the walls that heard your laughter and your tears. Reason is not pushing your mother out of her home while she's still alive." The room went quiet again. Ethan's smirk was gone. Melissa looked away, her jaw tight. I placed the will flat on the table, smoothing it with my palm. I've been quiet about this for too long. I've let you speak to me as though my life, my choices, and my home are just pieces on your chessboard. But I'm not a pawn. And this house, this life, is not for sale. I could feel my heart pounding, but there was also a strange calm washing over me. The fear I'd carried for months, maybe years, was gone. In its place was a steady certainty. Clara smiled faintly at me, her eyes glistening. "That's my girl," she murmured. Melissa broke the silence. "So, what now?" I gathered the document, folded it neatly, and placed it back in its envelope. Now you listen, because there's more you need to know. Before all the arguments, before the sideways comments and quiet tension, my home was filled with the kind of warmth you couldn't buy, the kind that seeps into the walls, the floors, and even the air. Saturdays were my favorite. I'd wake up to the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the house, sunlight pouring through the kitchen window. Back then, Ethan would come downstairs in his flannel pajama pants, his hair sticking up in all directions, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was always a slow riser, but the moment the pancakes hit the table, he'd grin and say, "You're the best, Mom." I can still hear the sound of David's deep laugh from the other side of the table, teasing Ethan about eating too fast. David was a good man, steady, patient, and always the first to help a neighbor shovel their driveway or fix a leaky faucet. Together, we'd spent nearly 3 decades turning this house into a home. We didn't have much money when we bought it, but every nail, every coat of paint, every patch of the garden was touched by our own hands. The living room still holds the couch David and I bought the year Ethan started kindergarten. I wanted to replace it once, but David just smiled and said, "It's got stories in it, Maggie. You don't throw away stories." That was David, sentimental in the best way. Even after he passed, I kept the traditions alive. On Sunday afternoons, I'd cook a big meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans the way David liked them. Ethan would bring Melissa, and they'd sit at the same table where he'd once done his homework as a boy. We'd talk about his work, their plans for Emily, their little girl. Back then, it felt like family was still the center of everything. Holidays were even better. I'd spend days preparing, pies cooling on the counter, the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifting through the house. The tree would be glowing in the corner of the living room, ornaments that David and I collected over the years hanging from its branches. Ethan would always hang the little snowman ornament he made in 2nd grade right in the front, saying, "It's the best one, Mom. Gotta show it off." And my mother, Clara, was always part of it. Even in her 80s, she would help set the table, folding napkins just right. She'd tell Ethan stories about his grandfather, about the early days when she and my father struggled but still found joy. Ethan used to listen with that boyish spark in his eyes, asking questions, smiling like he understood the weight of what came before him. In those days, I never imagined we'd be sitting at that same table years later, arguing about whether I should sell the very home that held all of those memories. The house wasn't just shelter. It was a living scrapbook. Every scuff on the floor had a story. The dent in the hallway wall was from the time Ethan tried to race his tricycle indoors when he was 4. The faded patch of paint in the dining room, that was where David once tried to hang a shelf, misjudged the level, and ended up making a hole the size of a dinner plate. We laughed about it for weeks. This was the place where we celebrated birthdays, where I cried quietly in the kitchen after sending Ethan off to college, where David and I danced to old records on Friday nights when the house was ours again. I'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and just walk through the rooms, feeling the quiet hum of a life well lived. And when Ethan became a father, I thought the cycle would continue. I pictured Emily growing up here, her small footsteps echoing down the hallway, maybe even learning to bake in the same kitchen where her father once stood on a stool to reach the mixing bowl. I wanted her to know this place, to feel the same comfort and belonging it gave me. In those moments, I never thought I'd need to defend the house. I never thought I'd have to explain its worth to my own son. To me, it wasn't an asset. It was the core of who we were as a family. Selling it would have felt like selling pieces of my life. But at that time, I had no reason to believe Ethan would see it differently. He hugged me when he visited, kissed my cheek, called me Mom, in that soft way that still melted my heart. Melissa would bring over a pie from the bakery, saying it was just to save me the trouble. Clara would sit in the recliner, sipping tea and watching us all, her eyes crinkled in quiet joy. Back then, everything felt safe. And maybe that's why I didn't see the signs when they started to show. Maybe that's why I dismissed the first offhand comment, the first strange look. I believed we were still the same family we'd always been, bound together by love, respect, and the shared history that filled every inch of this house. I was wrong. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day where the breeze is just warm enough to carry the smell of fresh-cut grass through the open windows. I had spent the morning baking an apple pie for dessert, the same way David liked it, with a buttery lattice crust brushed in cream. Ethan and Melissa were coming over for lunch, and I'd made roast chicken with rosemary from the garden. It wasn't a special occasion, but I still took my time, setting the table with the good plates and folding the napkins neatly. It was just how I liked to welcome my family. When they arrived, Emily ran straight to me, her little arms wrapping around my waist. "Grandma, can we play in the garden after we eat?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of her head. "The tulips are in bloom. You can help me pick some for the kitchen." Ethan followed behind, carrying a bottle of wine. Melissa was a few steps back, tapping on her phone. The meal started the way it always did, passing dishes, catching up on Emily's school projects, a bit of small talk about Ethan's work. But halfway through, Ethan leaned back in his chair and glanced around the dining room. "You know, Mom," he began, "this place is starting to feel old." I smiled, thinking he meant it in a nostalgic way. "Old? Well, it's been standing for over 40 years. That's what gives it charm." He gave a short laugh. "Charm, sure. But it could use some updating. Or maybe," he shrugged casually, "it's time to think about selling." I set my fork down slowly. "Selling? Why would I do that?" Melissa looked up from her plate for the first time. "You could get a really good price for it right now. The market's hot. You could move into a modern condo. No yard work, no repairs. So much easier for you." I glanced at Emily, who was nibbling on a dinner roll, oblivious to the shift in tone. "This isn't just a house to me," I said, keeping my voice light. "It's my home." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I know, Mom, but you're here alone most of the time. It's a lot of space for one person. You could sell, invest the money, travel, live a little." I chuckled, though it felt forced. "I live just fine right here. Besides, you grew up in this house. Don't you want Emily to have memories here too?" Melissa smiled politely, but with something unreadable behind her eyes. "Memories are nice, but you can make them anywhere. You don't need to keep an entire property just for sentiment." The room felt smaller somehow. I took a sip of water, hoping to change the subject. "Ethan, remember the summer you built that treehouse in the backyard with your dad?" He grinned faintly. "Yeah, it took forever, and Dad kept saying we had to measure twice, cut once." "That's right," I said. "It's still standing. Emily could—" "Mom," Ethan interrupted gently but firmly, "it's just a thought. Don't take it the wrong way." I smiled again, because that's what you do when you don't want to make a scene. "I'll think about it," I said, though I knew I wouldn't. We moved on to dessert, and the conversation turned to lighter topics. But the comment sat in my mind like a pebble in a shoe, small, but impossible to ignore. After they left that evening, I walked through the house slowly, touching the back of the dining chair where David always sat, running my fingers along the hallway wall where Ethan's childhood height marks were still penciled in. The word old echoed in my head. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it, I told myself. Maybe they were just concerned about me being here alone, but there had been something in his tone, a calculation I didn't want to believe was there. I baked another pie the following week, thinking they'd come over again soon, but part of me was already bracing for the next time the subject came up. After that Sunday lunch, the subject of the house started creeping into more conversations. Not always directly, sometimes it was subtle, almost offhand, but the meaning was clear enough. It began with fewer visits. Ethan and Melissa had always come over at least twice a month, but suddenly they were too busy. When they did come, the visits felt different. The warm hugs and long chats over coffee were replaced with quick hellos and glances at their phones. Even Emily, who used to run into my arms without hesitation, seemed more interested in showing me a new game on her tablet than walking through the garden like we used to. One afternoon, I called Ethan to ask if they'd like to come over for dinner. He hesitated. "We're trying to save time and money, Mom. Maybe we'll just eat at home this week." I laughed softly. "Dinner here is free, last I checked." He chuckled, but didn't commit to a day. It stung more than I wanted to admit. The next time they came, Melissa spent most of the visit in the living room with her laptop open, taking work calls. I tried to start a conversation, asking about her projects, but she only gave short, distracted answers. Ethan, meanwhile, wandered through the house, touching walls, peeking into rooms. "You ever think about how much work this place will need in 10 years?" he asked, almost absently. "Plenty of homes need upkeep, Ethan," I replied. "That's what makes them worth living in." He smiled faintly, but didn't look convinced. It wasn't just the conversations about the house, though. There was something else. Something quieter. A pulling away. At Christmas, I baked the same gingerbread cookies Ethan had loved since childhood. When I handed him a plate to take home, he smiled politely but said, "Thanks, Mom, but Melissa and I are cutting back on sugar." He set the plate on the counter and forgot to take it. In the weeks that followed, I noticed he didn't ask for my advice anymore. Not about work, not about parenting, not about life. Years ago, he used to call just to get my opinion, even if he didn't take it. Now, when I offered thoughts, he would nod vaguely and change the subject. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the way I started doubting myself. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head, wondering if I was saying something wrong, if I was being too sensitive. I caught myself tidying up the house before they came, not just cleaning, but moving things around, trying to make it look more modern, as if that might stop the comments. One spring afternoon, I invited them over for tea. I'd set out a plate of scones and fresh strawberry jam. Melissa arrived first, glancing around the kitchen. "You know," she said with a polite smile, "this space would be amazing if you knocked down that wall, open floor plan. It's what buyers want these days." I forced a smile. "Buyers? I'm not selling, Melissa." "Oh, of course," she said quickly, but her eyes said something else. Ethan arrived a few minutes later, his phone pressed to his ear. He mouthed hi at me, then spent the first 10 minutes pacing the hallway while finishing his call. When he finally sat down, I tried to start a conversation about Emily's school recital, but he only nodded distractedly, then asked, "Have you thought any more about that condo idea?" That was the first time I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him for a moment, and something in my chest tightened. By the time they left that day, I felt like I'd hosted strangers. Over the months, it became clear. The house wasn't just a topic for them. It was a goal, and I had become an obstacle. I noticed it in their tone, in their glances when I mentioned how much I loved the garden, in the way Melissa would talk about investment opportunities while looking straight at me. The erosion wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, like the slow wearing down of a shoreline. One wave at a time, the ground under me was disappearing. It was supposed to be a celebration. Clara was turning 87, and I'd been planning her birthday lunch for weeks. I reserved a private room at a small, family-owned restaurant in town, one she loved for its quiet atmosphere and home-cooked meals. I wanted it to be special, the kind of day she would remember fondly, surrounded by the people who loved her most. The room was warm and inviting, sunlight streaming through big front windows. The long table was decorated with wildflowers I'd picked from my garden that morning, arranged in little mason jars. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and Clara sat at the head of the table, wearing the pale blue shawl I'd knitted for her. Family members trickled in, hugging and laughing, passing small wrapped gifts across the table. Ethan and Melissa arrived fashionably late, Ethan carrying a small gift bag, Melissa with her phone in hand. She greeted Clara with a quick kiss on the cheek before sitting down. We ordered lunch, and for a while, everything felt light and pleasant. Clara told stories from her younger years. Ethan shared a few funny moments about Emily's latest school project, and we all laughed when Clara recounted how she once chased a raccoon out of her kitchen with a broom. But then, as the plates were being cleared, the conversation shifted. Melissa, holding her wine glass delicately between her fingers, looked at me across the table and said in a tone that was far too loud for the small room, "Margaret, you could really help Ethan out if you sold that old place of yours. Think of it as passing the torch." The laughter from a story moments earlier fizzled into silence. Every head turned in my direction. Ethan chuckled as if to soften it. "She's not wrong, Mom. You could get a great price right now. It'd be a smart move." I felt my cheeks grow warm. Clara's hand, frail but strong, reached for mine under the table and gave it a small squeeze. I tried to keep my tone light. "I appreciate your concern, but my home isn't for sale." Melissa tilted her head, giving a small laugh. "We're just saying it's a big responsibility for one person your age. You could be enjoying life without all that upkeep. Plus, you'd be setting Ethan up for the future." My fork rested on my plate, untouched. I could feel the weight of the room, the relatives shifting in their chairs, the awkward glances being exchanged. No one knew whether to speak up or pretend they hadn't heard. "I am enjoying my life," I said quietly, but my voice didn't carry the confidence I wanted it to. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Mom, don't be so sensitive. It's just a suggestion. We're thinking of what's best for everyone." Everyone. The word hit harder than I expected. It wasn't what's best for you, it was everyone. A neat way to include themselves in the decision about something that wasn't theirs. Clara's voice cut through the tension. "Some things aren't up for discussion," she said firmly. "A home like that is more than bricks and wood." Melissa smiled politely in her direction, but didn't respond. The rest of the meal felt different. The laughter didn't come as easily. I caught the sympathetic glances from a few cousins, but no one said much. I tried to stay present, to focus on Clara's joy, but I could feel the humiliation gnawing at me. When the cake came out, I pasted on a smile, lit the candles, and led the singing of Happy Birthday. Clara closed her eyes and made a wish before blowing out the candles, and for a moment I almost forgot the sting of what had just happened. But it returned on the drive home. I replayed the scene in my mind, the way Melissa had spoken like she was doing me a favor, the way Ethan had laughed, the way everyone else had just stayed quiet. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized how public it had been. They hadn't just questioned me, they'd done it in front of people who mattered to me, in a moment meant for celebration. When I got home, I placed the flowers from the restaurant on the kitchen counter and sat down in the quiet. The house felt heavier than usual, but also, strangely, it felt like it was holding me, protecting me. I ran my hand along the table where David once sat, where Ethan used to swing his legs as a child, and I told myself, they won't take this from me. I didn't say it out loud to them, not yet. But something in me shifted that day. After Clara's birthday lunch, something in me changed. It wasn't a sudden break, no shouting, no slammed doors, but more like a curtain being drawn, separating me from the part of my life that had once felt safe. For weeks after, I found excuses not to invite Ethan and Melissa over. I told myself it was because I was busy, tending the garden, reorganizing the attic, catching up on my quilting. But deep down, I knew it was because I didn't want to sit at my own table and feel like an intruder in my own home. The next time Ethan called, it wasn't to check on me or to chat about Emily. It was to ask if I'd considered downsizing. His tone was light, but there was a pressing undercurrent. "You'd be so much more comfortable, Mom," he said. "We could find you something close to us. No yard work, no repairs. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." I hesitated, keeping my voice even. "I'm comfortable here, Ethan." There was a pause. "You don't have to decide right away. Just think about it." I didn't tell him I'd already thought about it. I didn't tell him the answer would always be no. When Melissa texted a week later, "We should get together soon, maybe at our place," I agreed, partly because I didn't want another tense meal in my dining room. At their house, I noticed the difference immediately. Their home was sleek, modern, and spotless, but it felt cold. Melissa gave me a quick tour, as if I hadn't been there before, pointing out the new furniture and an open-concept kitchen she was clearly proud of. Over dinner, the conversation eventually circled back, as I knew it would. Melissa sipped her wine and said casually, "You know, your kitchen would be amazing if you took out that wall to the dining room. Or, honestly, if you sold the place, you could buy something like this." I smiled faintly, pretending to admire the space, but inside, something tightened. I realized I was no longer being invited into their home as a mother or grandmother. I was being positioned. Me, my life, my house. It was all part of their mental calculations. From that evening on, I stopped offering invitations. I didn't cut them off, but I created distance. Phone calls became shorter. I kept my visits brief. When they suggested meeting at my house, I'd say, "Why don't we meet in town instead?" They didn't seem to notice, or maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, the silence between us grew. At first, the solitude hurt. I missed Emily's laughter in the backyard, Ethan teasing me about my antique coffee maker, even Melissa's cautious attempts at small talk. But there was also a strange sense of relief. Without their visits, my home felt mine again. I could walk through the rooms without imagining their eyes scanning the walls, assessing the furniture, mentally calculating square footage and market value. I started spending more time in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with my hands deep in the earth, planting rows of tomatoes and sunflowers. David used to say that gardens are like marriages. They need constant care, patience, and a little faith. I thought about that a lot. Still, the quiet moments brought their own kind of ache. One rainy night, I was curled up in my armchair with a blanket, listening to the storm against the roof. The power flickered once, then again, before cutting out completely. The house went dark. I lit a few candles and sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow casting shadows on the walls. In that moment, I thought of David, how he would have made a joke about roughing it and then pulled out a deck of cards to pass the time. I thought of the years we'd spent here together, of the love that had built this home long before Ethan's ambitions touched it. The storm rattled the windows, and I realized that even without power, even without company, I felt more at peace in this moment than I had in months. When the lights finally came back on, I didn't rush to call anyone. I simply went to bed, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background reminding me that life in this house went on, with or without them. I didn't know it yet, but I was beginning to pull away, not in anger, but in quiet self-preservation. I wasn't ready to fight, not yet. But I was no longer willing to let them chip away at me. They thought my silence meant surrender. They didn't realize it was the first step towards something else entirely. The first truly cold night of winter came earlier than expected. The air outside had that sharp, metallic bite that seeps into your bones before you even realize it. The wind rattled the bare branches against the windows like bony fingers scratching at the glass. I'd spent the afternoon clearing out the last of the garden, cutting down the brittle remains of the sunflowers, pulling up the frostbitten tomato plants. My gloves were damp, and my knees ached from kneeling in the frozen soil. By the time I got inside, the chill had followed me. I wrapped myself in David's old cardigan. the one with the worn elbows and faint smell of cedar from the closet, and sat in my armchair with a cup of tea. The phone sat on the table next to me, silent. It had been weeks since Ethan or Melissa had stopped by. Even Emily's little phone calls, her excited voice telling me about a school project or a new friend, had become rare. I told myself it was just life, that everyone was busy, but the truth settled heavy in my chest. I wasn't part of their world anymore unless they needed something. The loneliness was sharp that night. I switched on the small lamp beside me, its yellow light barely reaching the far corners of the living room. The shadows made the house feel bigger, emptier. The photos on the mantel caught my eye. David holding a much younger Ethan on his shoulders at the beach, Clara laughing at some long-forgotten joke, a snapshot of Emily at 3 years old with cake smeared on her face. They were frozen in moments where love was certain, where I never once questioned my place in their lives. Now, I wasn't so sure. I tried reading, but the words blurred together. The silence pressed in, thick and unyielding. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. When the wind howled against the house, I imagined what it would be like if I didn't live here anymore. The thought made my stomach twist. Around 8 o'clock, the power flickered once, then again, before cutting out completely. The house fell into darkness. I sat there for a moment, listening to the wind outside, the faint creaks of the wood adjusting to the cold. I lit a few candles, their small flames trembling with each draft. The kitchen looked almost ghostly in the flickering light. I remembered the last power outage David and I had weathered here. How he'd made me laugh by pretending we were pioneers. How we'd eaten peanut butter straight from the jar and played cards until the lights came back on. But now, there was no one to share the joke. I sat at the kitchen table, the candle casting a halo around the cup of tea in front of me, now cold. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, heavier. My mind wandered to Ethan's voice on the phone suggesting, no, urging, that I sell the house. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe they'd already decided I didn't matter as much as the money they could get from it. It wasn't just about the house. It was about being erased, piece by piece. About becoming invisible in the very story I had helped write. A gust of wind made the candle flicker dangerously low, and I pulled my cardigan tighter. The storm outside roared, but inside, the louder noise was the one in my head. Every comment, every dismissal, every moment I'd been talked over or brushed aside. I stared at the shadows on the wall until my eyes burned. For a moment, I thought about what would happen if I were gone, if I simply disappeared one day. Who would notice first? Would anyone miss me for more than a week? Or would my absence just be another logistical matter for Ethan to handle? The thought scared me more than the dark. When the power finally returned, I didn't move right away. The sudden brightness felt harsh, almost intrusive, as if it was shining a light on just how far I'd let myself sink. I got up slowly, blew out the candles, and stood for a long moment in the middle of the kitchen. My legs felt heavy, my chest hollow. I wasn't ready to fight yet. I wasn't even sure I could. But deep down, in a place I hadn't touched in years, something whispered that I wasn't finished. Not yet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle, icy calm. The next morning, the world outside was coated in frost, the garden dusted in a thin, sparkling layer that caught the weak winter sunlight. Inside, the house smelled faintly of extinguished candles and the lavender polish I'd used on the dining table days before. I decided to spend the day tackling a chore I'd been putting off for years, reorganizing the desk in David's old study. Since he passed, it had become a sort of storage catch-all, drawers stuffed with old letters, receipts, instruction manuals for appliances I no longer owned. The study was the smallest room in the house, but it still carried his presence. The shelves were lined with books he loved, the kind that still had his notes scribbled in the margins. His leather chair sat in the corner, faintly cracked from years of use. The air held the faint scent of cedar and paper, the smell of history. I started with the top drawer, sorting through stacks of unopened mail from charities, yellowed electric bills from decades ago, and a few family photographs I'd forgotten existed. Then, in the bottom drawer, beneath an old tax folder, I found a large manila envelope with David's handwriting across the front. For Margaret, important. My heart gave a small, unsteady thump. I sat down in his chair, the envelope in my lap, and stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a neatly folded stack of papers. The first page titled, Last Will and Testament of David Kane. I had seen a copy of his will after the funeral, but I hadn't thought about it in years. Still, as I unfolded it, the memory of that time washed over me, the quiet numbness of grief, the way the lawyer's voice had sounded far away. But this wasn't just a legal document. This was David speaking to me from a place where there was no more time to change his mind. My eyes scanned the pages, and then I found it. The clause that made my breath catch. I leave our family home, located at 214 Willow Lane, solely to my wife, Margaret Kane, with the expressed wish that it is never to be sold unless she, and she alone, chooses to do so. The words were clear, deliberate, and final. David had known this house wasn't just a piece of property. He had known it was part of us, our history, our work, our love. I read the line again, slower this time. She, and she alone, chooses. No Ethan, no Melissa, no family consensus or what's best for everyone, just me. The tears came before I could stop them. Not loud, shaking sobs, but quiet streams that blurred the words on the page. It wasn't just about the house. It was about David seeing me, even after death, as the one who should decide. He had trusted me to protect what we'd built, to know when and if it should be let go. He had trusted me more than anyone else. I thought about all the conversations with Ethan over the past year, all the times he had spoken to me as if my opinion were secondary, as if I were simply holding on to something that should rightfully pass to him. And here, in my hands, was proof that David had not agreed with him, proof that my voice mattered, proof that I had been right to hold my ground. I sat in the study for a long time, the winter light shifting slowly across the carpet. My fingers traced the ink of David's signature, the familiar loops of his handwriting. In that moment, I didn't feel quite as alone. This document was more than paper. It was a shield. It was a promise. I placed it back into the envelope carefully, but I didn't tuck it away again. This time, I left it on the desk where I could see it when I passed by. Something in me had shifted. The heaviness of the past months, the constant erosion, the quiet humiliations, didn't disappear, but it felt different now. Less like a slow drowning, and more like a current I could swim against if I chose. David's voice echoed in my mind, "Never let anyone take it from you, Maggie." I looked around the study, at the books, the chair, the framed photo of him holding Ethan as a boy, and I realized I wasn't just holding on to the house. I was holding on to the part of myself that still believed I had the right to decide my own future. And now I had something in writing that said I did. For days after finding David's will, I carried it around the house like a talisman, not literally in my hand all the time, but I'd take it out, read that one sentence again, and feel the weight of the words settle over me like armor. She, and she alone, chooses. It wasn't just legal language, it was validation. It was my late husband, in his own unmistakable voice, telling me I wasn't wrong to fight for what was mine. And yet, I realized with a kind of startled shame, I hadn't been fighting. Not really. I'd been dodging, avoiding, letting the current carry me instead of swimming against it. That changed the moment I understood something important. Ethan and Melissa didn't just want the house. They wanted control. And every time I hesitated, every time I softened my answer to avoid conflict, I'd been handing them a little piece of it. The realization came to me one morning as I was folding laundry in the living room. The TV was on low, just background noise, and I heard a home renovation show host say, "Sometimes you have to tear something down to build it back better." It made me stop, a dish towel still in my hands. For months, they had been trying to tear me down, with little jabs, suggestions, public comments that made me doubt myself. And I'd been letting them. But maybe, just maybe, I could use that same principle in reverse. If they thought I was weak, maybe that was my advantage. I started paying closer attention in every conversation. When Ethan brought up the house on the phone, I didn't argue, but I also didn't give ground. I'd just say, "I'll think about it," in a tone that didn't reveal a thing. It was strange, but I began to notice that my silence unsettled him more than my resistance ever had. Melissa, on the other hand, doubled down. She started sending me articles about the benefits of downsizing or the financial security of selling in a hot market. I didn't respond to a single one. The old me would have politely said thanks or explained why I disagreed. The new me just let the messages sit there, unopened. In the quiet of my home, I began to reclaim pieces of myself. I took long walks in the garden, pruning the rose bushes, clearing the dead leaves, feeling the familiar ache in my knees as something almost comforting. I cleaned out David's workshop, running my hands over the tools he'd used for decades. Every hammer, every chisel felt like a reminder that we had built this life ourselves, and no one was going to take it from me without a fight. One evening, I pulled down the photo albums from the top shelf in the hall closet. I sat at the dining table, flipping through page after page of our lives. Christmas mornings, summer barbecues, birthdays, Emily as a toddler running barefoot through the backyard. Each photo was another stitch in the fabric of why this place mattered. By the time I closed the last album, I knew I wasn't just keeping a house. I was keeping a legacy. And I knew something else too. This wasn't going to be resolved with polite refusals. If I wanted to protect what was mine, I'd need to be smart, strategic, patient. I began making small, quiet moves. I started looking into property law in my state, just enough to understand my rights. I called Sarah, my oldest friend, who has never been afraid to say what she thinks, and told her what was going on. She didn't gasp or pity me. She just said, "Well, Maggie, sounds like you've got more power than you thought. Use it." Her confidence in me was like a spark catching on dry kindling. In the days that followed, I stopped feeling like I was reacting to Ethan and Melissa. I started feeling like I was the one setting the pace, even if they didn't know it. I kept my tone friendly when we spoke, but I noticed something shift in me. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I was watching, measuring, waiting for the right moment. David's will hadn't just given me the legal right to choose. It had reminded me that I still had a choice. About the house, about my dignity, about whether I would let my own son talk to me like I was already a footnote in his life. That morning in the study, I'd opened a document. But what I'd really opened was the door to something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. Once I decided I wasn't going to be pushed out of my own home, the question became, how do I make sure they can't try this again? The answer wasn't to yell or to cut them off completely. That would only confirm whatever narrative they'd built about me, that I was being emotional or unreasonable. No. The real power was in letting them believe I was still pliable, while quietly making sure the ground beneath them was slipping away. I started with the paperwork. David's will was my shield, but I wanted an unshakable wall around it. I made an appointment with a lawyer Sarah recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who didn't mince words. Sitting across from her desk, I explained everything, the comments, the pressure, the public humiliation, and finally, the discovery of the will. Patricia listened, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Margaret, you're in a very strong position, but you're right to be cautious. People who think they're entitled to something often double down when they realize they might lose it." Her advice was simple but powerful. Make my intentions legally bulletproof. We updated my own will, clearly stating that the house would pass directly to Emily, skipping Ethan and Melissa entirely. Patricia also helped me draft a living trust, locking the property under my name with terms that only I could alter. When the papers were ready, I signed them without hesitation. It felt like sealing a vault. I didn't tell Ethan or Melissa about any of it. On the phone, I was the same mother they thought they knew, polite, warm, and non-committal. If Ethan asked about the house, I'd say, "I'm still thinking it over," or "maybe in the future." I made sure my tone was neutral, even friendly. I wanted them to think they still had time to convince me. Meanwhile, I started making quiet changes at home. I had the locks replaced. Officially, it was just for security, but really, it was to make sure no one had a spare key floating around. I went through old files, shredding anything with personal or financial information that wasn't necessary to keep. I transferred certain accounts into more secure formats, the kind that required my direct authorization for any changes. Outside of legal and financial moves, I made emotional preparations too. That meant building a support network, not for advice, but for grounding. Sarah became my sounding board. Clara, though frail, offered the kind of wisdom only a mother can. "You don't have to fight like they do," she told me one afternoon over tea. "You just have to stand so steady that they run themselves tired trying to move you." I also started keeping a small notebook, not a journal, but a record. Every time Ethan or Melissa made a comment about the house, every time they tried to push me in a certain direction, I wrote it down with the date and time. Not because I planned to use it in court, but because it reminded me this wasn't in my head. It was real. Then came the small, deliberate invitations. I'd ask them over for dinner now and then, not often enough for them to get too comfortable, but just enough to keep up appearances. During those dinners, I'd let them talk, steering the conversation toward topics they cared about. If the house came up, I'd smile and nod, maybe even ask, "What kind of place do you think I'd get if I sold?" It was bait, and they took it every time. Melissa would pull up listings on her phone, showing me glossy condos with rooftop pools and gym access. Ethan would talk about smart investments and liquid assets. I'd make little sounds and tilt my head like I was considering it. Inside, I was already picturing the day they'd realize all of this had been wasted breath. The truth was, I had no intention of selling, but letting them think I might kept them from becoming aggressive too soon. It bought me time, and time was all I needed to get every piece of my plan in place. I began hosting more in the house again. Not for Ethan and Melissa, but for other family members, neighbors, old friends. I wanted people who actually valued this place to be here, to fill it with laughter and conversation again. It reminded me that I wasn't preserving an empty shell. I was keeping alive a space that had meaning. By the end of that winter, everything was ready. My will was updated, my trust was in place, my documents were secure, and my resolve was steady. Ethan and Melissa still believed they were slowly wearing me down, but the truth was, I had been building something they couldn't see, a quiet fortress around myself and this home. All that was left was to decide when to open the gates and let them see it. It didn't happen all at once. Power never does. It shifts quietly, in increments so small the other person doesn't notice until they suddenly feel it's gone. The first change was in my voice. I didn't raise it. I didn't argue. I simply stopped filling silence with explanations. When Ethan or Melissa made a comment about the house, I no longer justified my decisions or scrambled to prove my reasoning. I'd just smile faintly and say, "I'll think about it." The pause that followed was always the same, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a slight tightening of their mouths. They weren't used to not getting a reaction. When they called, I stopped answering right away. I'd let the phone ring, let them leave a message, and then call back on my time. Sometimes, if the message was about the house, I wouldn't call back for a day or two. It was subtle, but I could hear the edge of frustration in Ethan's voice when I finally picked up. I began deciding where we met. If they suggested coming over, I'd counter with, "Why don't we meet for lunch in town?" I picked the restaurants, the times, the seating. I don't think they realized at first how much of our interactions were now happening on my terms. During these lunches, I'd guide the conversation toward Emily, toward Ethan's work, toward Melissa's projects. I made them feel like I was still invested in their lives. And I was. But I also avoided giving them any opening to corner me about the house. The few times they tried, I noticed something interesting. Their language was changing. They were no longer telling me what I should do, they were asking. Not politely, not humbly, but there was a hesitation now, as if they were checking the temperature before stepping into the water. That's when I knew the shift was happening. I also made a point to be visibly thriving. If Melissa dropped by unannounced, which she did once or twice, she didn't find me sitting alone in the dim living room. She found me hosting my book club, the house filled with laughter and chatter. She saw fresh flowers on the table, the smell of something baking in the oven. When Ethan came over to help with a small repair, I already had it done. "The neighbor's son fixed it yesterday," I'd say casually, handing him a cup of coffee. "He's a nice boy, said he's happy to help any time." I wanted them to see that I wasn't a fragile woman clinging to a house she couldn't manage. I was capable, independent, and, perhaps most importantly, happy without their interference. One day, during a lunch at a small Italian place Ethan liked, he leaned across the table and said, "You know, Mom, Melissa and I have been thinking, if you ever do decide to sell, we'd want to make sure you found a place you loved." It was the first time I'd heard him phrase it as if instead of when. I met his gaze and smiled. "That's thoughtful of you, Ethan." Then I changed the subject to Emily's piano recital. Inside, I felt something loosen, a knot I hadn't even realized was still there. The biggest tell came a few weeks later. Melissa called to check in and mentioned that the market wasn't as strong as it had been. "It might not be the right time to sell," she said lightly. That was when I knew they were hedging. They still didn't know about the will, the trust, or the updates I'd made to my own estate plan. But they were starting to sense that whatever influence they thought they had was slipping, and they couldn't figure out why. I didn't gloat. I didn't push. I just kept doing what I was doing, answering when I wanted, hosting who I wanted, maintaining the house without their help. It wasn't about winning, it was about reclaiming the balance, about letting them see, piece by piece, that their leverage had never been as strong as they believed. By spring, the air between us felt different. Still polite, still family, but no longer weighted in their favor. I could see it in their eyes when they looked at me, not exactly respect yet, but recognition. They were beginning to understand something I had known for months. I wasn't going anywhere. And soon they'd find out just how permanent that was. The day I decided to tell them was a bright Sunday in late spring. The kind of day where the air feels clean and the light falls just right through the windows. I invited Ethan, Melissa, and Emily for lunch. I kept the tone of the invitation light, the way I used to. "Come by around 1, we'll have a proper meal together." Melissa sounded surprised but agreeable. Ethan just said, "Sure, Mom, we'll be there." I spent the morning cooking roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, not because I wanted to soften the moment, but because I wanted it to feel like home. The smell of rosemary and butter filled the kitchen, mixing with the faint scent of the lilacs I'd placed in a vase on the table. When they arrived, I greeted Emily first, scooping her into a hug. She chattered about a science project at school, completely unaware of the current running beneath the day. We ate mostly in peace, with casual talk about work, school, and the warm weather. I waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured. The pie sat untouched in the center of the table, its lattice crust still glistening. That's when I brought out the envelope. It was the same manila one I'd found in David's study months ago. I placed it on the table between us, my hands resting lightly on top of it. Ethan glanced at it, then at me. "What's that?" I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Since you've both been asking about the house for quite some time, I think it's time we talk about it properly." Melissa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "If this is about—" "It's about clarity," I interrupted, my tone steady. "And respect." I opened the envelope and unfolded the will, the paper soft from years in storage but still perfectly legible. My voice didn't waver. "This is your father's will. He left the house solely to me, with the expressed wish that it is never to be sold unless I choose to sell it. Not you. not anyone else. Me. The words hung in the air. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw. I kept going. I've made my choice. I'm not selling, not now, not ever while I'm alive. And when I'm gone, the house will go directly to Emily. It will bypass you entirely. Ethan blinked. What? His voice was quiet but sharp. You heard me, I said, sliding another document from the envelope. My updated will. It's already in writing, it's legal, and it's final. Melissa's lips parted, but no sound came out. This isn't about punishing you, I continued. It's about honoring your father's wishes and protecting what we built together. This house is part of our family's history. I won't see it turned into a transaction. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Mom, you could have talked to me about this. I tried, I said, my voice still calm but unyielding. For over a year, I've listened to your suggestions, your pressures, your so-called concern. You didn't hear me. So now, you're hearing me clearly. The room was still. Even Emily, sensing something serious, had gone quiet. Melissa broke the silence. It's your decision, of course, but don't you think— No, I said simply. I don't. I folded the papers neatly and slid them back into the envelope, placing it on my side of the table. From this moment forward, the subject of selling this house is closed. If you bring it up again, you won't get an answer. Ethan sat back slowly, his eyes on the table. I couldn't tell if it was anger, disappointment, or something else, but I didn't look away. Clara's words from months ago echoed in my mind. You just have to stand so steady that they run themselves tired trying to move you. This was me, standing steady. Finally, Ethan nodded once. All right, Mom. His voice was low, resigned. I poured more coffee, the clink of the spoon against the mug the only sound for a moment. Then I smiled at Emily. Now, who wants pie? Her hand shot up, and the heaviness in the air loosened just slightly. I served dessert, and though the conversation never quite recovered its earlier warmth, it no longer carried the weight of unspoken battles. They had heard me, and they knew I meant it. It was 2 weeks after the lunch. I hadn't heard much from Ethan or Melissa in that time. A couple of short texts about Emily's school activities. Nothing more. There was a politeness in the messages, almost cautious, as if they were feeling out the new boundaries. Then one afternoon, I was in the garden, pruning back the roses, when the phone rang. It was Melissa. Her voice was pleasant, but there was a brittleness underneath. Margaret, I just wanted to let you know that Ethan and I have been thinking. We might have been too pushy about the house. I kept my tone neutral. I appreciate you saying that. There was a pause before she continued. But if something ever did happen to you unexpectedly, you'd want to make sure Ethan could handle things, right? We could— That's already taken care of, I said simply. Silence. What do you mean? She asked. I glanced toward the kitchen, where the manila envelope sat in its usual place. I mean that everything is already legally arranged. The house, the property, the land, all of it will pass directly to Emily through a trust. You and Ethan will have no say in selling it, and it will be protected until she's old enough to decide what she wants to do. Melissa's voice sharpened. You put it in a trust? Yes, I said. Months ago. Another pause, then a tight, I see. She ended the call soon after. I thought that was the end of it, but the real twist came a week later at Emily's piano recital. The community center auditorium was warm and filled with the hum of parents and grandparents chatting before the program began. I spotted Ethan and Melissa sitting toward the front and made my way to an empty seat beside Clara, who had insisted on coming despite her bad knee. Emily's performance was beautiful. Tentative at first, then stronger as she gained confidence. When the applause died down, she came running up the aisle toward me, her face glowing. "Grandma, did you hear me mess up in the middle?" she whispered. I hugged her. "I heard you be wonderful from start to finish." As the audience began to file out, Ethan approached, his hands in his pockets. Melissa trailed behind, smiling politely but saying nothing. "Mom," Ethan began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about Dad's wishes. I didn't realize, I guess I didn't want to realize, how much this house means to you." I studied his face. There was sincerity there, but also something else. Maybe the weight of knowing he'd lost this particular battle. Before I could respond, Emily piped up, looking between us. "Daddy, Grandma told me that someday the house will be mine. She said it's so I can always have a place to come back to." Melissa's head snapped toward her. "She told you that?" "Yes," Emily said proudly. "And I'm going to keep the garden just like she has it." The look that passed over Melissa's face in that moment was fleeting but unmistakable. Realization, frustration, resignation. She hadn't just lost the house, she'd lost any future chance of controlling it. The promise was already living in Emily's heart. Ethan gave a small nod, almost to himself, and said quietly, "Well, I guess that's settled then." "Yes," I said, smiling at Emily. "It's settled." We all walked out together into the crisp evening air, but something had shifted. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel defensive. I felt done. The matter was closed, not because I'd argued them into submission, but because I'd built a wall so high and so solid that there was no way through. And the most satisfying part? The knowledge that when I was gone, the house wouldn't pass through their hands at all. It would go straight to the little girl who had just stood on stage and played her heart out. The one person in the family who saw the house not as a financial asset, but as a place of love. That was my final justice. It was about a month after Emily's recital when Ethan called. Not a text, not a quick check-in, an actual phone call. I was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when the phone rang, the radio softly playing an old jazz tune. When I saw his name on the screen, I hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Ethan," I replied, keeping my voice warm but steady. "How are you?" "I'm good. I was wondering if I could come by this afternoon. Just me. Melissa's out with Emily." There was a pause where he seemed to be waiting for me to ask why, but I didn't. "All right," I said. "Come around 3. I'll put the kettle on." When he arrived, he looked different, less polished. No suit jacket, just a worn hoodie and jeans. His hair was a little messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. We sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea. For a while we talked about nothing. The weather, a game Emily was playing on her tablet, how Clara was doing. Then he set his mug down and let out a breath. "Mom, I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "I didn't say anything right away. I was thinking about what you told us, about Dad's will, and I realized I wasn't listening to you before. I was listening to what I wanted to hear. I thought I was being practical, but I wasn't thinking about what this place means to you." His voice had that uneven quality it sometimes got when he was trying to be sincere. I believed he meant at least part of it. "I appreciate you saying that," I said quietly. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I'm not asking you to change your mind. I don't want this to come between us." That was the moment where, years ago, I might have reached across the table, taken his hands, and promised that nothing could come between us. But I had learned something in these past months. Connection means nothing if it's built on me giving up pieces of myself to keep the peace. "I don't want that either," I told him. "But I think we both know we can't pretend the last year didn't happen. I'm not angry anymore, Ethan. I'm just different now. And that's all right." He looked down, nodding slowly. "I guess I am too." We talked for a little while longer, about lighter things this time. He told me Emily wanted to plant sunflowers in their yard and that she'd been asking if she could come help me in my garden this summer. "She's always welcome," I said, smiling. "Anytime." When he stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. "Thanks for letting me come over, Mom." "Of course," I said. "The door's always open, but so are my boundaries." That made him huff out a small, awkward laugh. "Fair enough." After he left, I stood at the window for a while, watching him walk down the path to his car. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I just felt settled. It wasn't the kind of reconciliation where everything was suddenly perfect again. There were still cracks. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single afternoon over tea. But I no longer needed him to see everything my way for me to feel whole. I realized something important as I rinsed out our mugs and set them on the drying rack. My peace wasn't going to depend on whether Ethan changed completely or whether Melissa ever understood. My peace was mine now, because I'd stopped giving anyone else the power to take it. Later that week, Emily called me herself. "Grandma, Daddy says I can come plant flowers with you next weekend. Can we?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said, smiling into the phone. "We'll make it a sunflower day." That was the reconnection I cared about most. Not the tentative truce with Ethan, but the steady, unshakable bond with the little girl who would one day inherit this home. The one person who didn't see it as a bargaining chip, but as a place to grow things, and as long as she understood that, I had all the connection I needed. It was early summer when I finally felt the shift settle into something permanent. The garden was alive again, green shoots pushing through the soil, the roses blooming in soft layers of pink and cream. Emily had been by the week before, her small hands digging into the dirt beside mine, carefully placing sunflower seeds in neat little rows. She'd announced that they would be as tall as the house one day. I told her I hoped they would be taller. That morning the air was warm, but not yet heavy, the kind of day that made you want to leave the windows open so the breeze could wander in and out at will. I carried a cup of tea to the porch, the steam curling into the air, and settled into the old wicker chair David and I had bought at a yard sale 30 years ago. From the porch, I could see nearly everything: the curve of the driveway, the lilacs by the fence, the garden beds stretching toward the back. The house behind me felt solid, steady, as if it was standing watch just as much as I was. It struck me then how different I felt compared to a year ago. Back then, I'd been bracing myself for the next comment, the next push, the next attempt to take something from me. Every visit had felt like a test, every conversation like a negotiation. Now I wasn't bracing anymore. I was simply here. I thought about the quiet battles I'd fought, not the shouting matches or the dramatic ultimatums, but the moments where I had to hold my ground in stillness. Those were harder in some ways, because no one applauds you for not giving in. But they matter. They build something in you. On the little side table next to me was the manila envelope. I kept it there now, not because I expected to need it, but because it reminded me of where the turning point had been. Inside were David's words, simple, deliberate, unwavering. She, and she alone, chooses. I smiled to myself. I'd chosen. I thought about Ethan's visit, the apology, the way he'd looked down when I told him I was different now. It wasn't the perfect reconciliation some might hope for, but I didn't need perfect. I just needed respect, and I had it, at least enough to keep the peace. Melissa? I didn't expect she'd ever truly understand. But that was all right. I'd stopped needing her to. The truth was, the real change hadn't been in them. It had been in me. I had learned that peace wasn't something someone could hand me after agreeing to my terms. It was something I could claim quietly, without permission. It was the same way you tend a garden. Not by controlling every leaf and stem, but by protecting the roots and letting the rest grow as it will. As the sunlight shifted, I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. Birds were calling in the trees. A bee hummed lazily near the roses. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. This was what I'd fought for. Not just the house, but the life inside it. The space to drink my tea on this porch without wondering when someone would try to take it away. The right to decide my own ending. I reached down and picked up one of the sunflower seeds Emily had left in my pocket, rolling it between my fingers. In a few months, it would be a towering stalk, golden petals turned toward the sun. Just like the house, it would stand exactly where it was meant to be, no matter how many times the wind tried to bend it. I pressed the seed into the dirt of the planter beside me, covering it gently with soil. "Grow tall," I murmured. Then I sat back in the chair, letting the breeze carry the scent of lilacs across the porch, and thought about how sometimes the best kind of victory is the one where nothing changes at all, except you.